Everyone, Professor V here again. Today we're going to be looking at the Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution found in the Bill of Rights, and something that we just briefly talked about at the end of our last discussion, just to get us thinking about this fascinating and controversial amendment. So, as you recall, the Eighth Amendment is a prohibition on four things. And anytime you hear prohibition, people might think back to, for example, when alcohol was prohibited in the United States in the early 1900s. And then, of course, that didn't last very long and that was changed. Prohibition, of course, just means not being allowed to do something. So, in the case of the Eighth Amendment, the government is prohibited from four things. They are prohibited from excessive bail, fines, and from cruel and unusual punishment. So we're going to take them one at a time, and each of them is controversial. It is rather subjective. Of course, there's historical context for everything, but let's go one by one and see what's the point of this amendment, and then what do you all think about what this amendment should look like? What do those words mean to you when you hear excessive fine or excessive bail? And what to you or to society should count as cruel and unusual punishment? So, the cool thing about the Eighth Amendment is it's pretty short, right to the point, and there's straight four prohibitions the government is precluded from doing. So, when we talk about bail, first of all, bail you probably are familiar with again if you watch like the shows or maybe seen commercials for bail bonds companies. Bail is the idea that you say are charged with a crime. And let's just say for this analogy, and because we're all so great people, we would never commit a crime, we're innocent. But you or I are arrested, you're accused of doing something you didn't do. They say, well, we think that you're the person that robbed 7-Eleven and we would like to well, we're going to charge you with this, and your court date is going to be 3 months from now, and you can have a lawyer. And we talked about the Miranda rights. They're going to have to tell you all that stuff, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments. But before we get to that part with going to trial, bail is before a trial. So again, if you didn't do the robbery, we could also explore if someone did. But just for this first analogy, if you didn't do the robbery, you're being accused of something that could ruin your life, that will cost you your job, probably cost you your family, maybe cost you almost every job in the future. Not to mention you would be in prison or jail. So this is really important that if you're an innocent person, especially, you have the right to be presumed innocent until found guilty. And so if you wanted to write down this, what is the original purpose of bail? Is it's to stay consistent with the assumption that you're innocent until proven guilty. So if you are accused of robbing 7-Eleven and you get charged and they read your Miranda rights and all that, and they say your trial's in 3 months, this is how much bail is going to be. And let's just say in this case, bail is set by the judge, which would be the usual way to do it, um, at $10,000. Okay, so today you're accused of something you didn't do, and you're thrown in jail, and you're gonna go to trial, but not for many months. And you either have a choice: do I pay $10,000 and go live my life until the trial and don't lose my job and hopefully don't lose my family and friends and all this? Don't lose your school, your education, your classes you'd have to miss. You pay that $10,000. Now, here's the good news. If you go back to trial and then are proven innocent, then you get the money back. So you might say, well, what's the big problem then? Well, here's where it gets interesting. If you're anything like me, you might not have $10,000 just lying around. So if you are accused of a crime, you're going to have to borrow, most people, would have to borrow $10,000. Now, first you might say, well, maybe you have a friend that you know, or somewhere that someone that's wealthy in your family. That's great. But for people who don't have that possibility, the rest of, an average person, especially the higher cost you go with thousands and thousands of bail, depending on your income, $500 could be excessive. And this is where it gets so tricky to say what counts as excessive. Well, in terms of bail, let's just say for this, finishing this scenario, you are innocent. You do pay the $10,000. You go home, you live your life, you come back in a couple of months. In the trial, you're proven innocent. The government gives you your $10,000 back. But remember, we didn't have, you and I, we don't have that money. We had to borrow it. And most likely that's where those bail bonds companies would come in. It's a really simple business. You pay someone's bail for them, and then they pay you back with interest. So it's a really, it's a very straightforward business. There's people that are going to be accused. They don't want to sit in prison or jail till their trial. So they pay the bail and then they come back. And here's the good news. You and I get proven innocent. We come back, $10,000 is back in our pocket, but that money is obviously going to go to the bail bonds company because we borrowed that. But do you think that they just did it to be nice? Maybe, but most of them are businesses. And the businesses, I'm going to charge you, say, 15% or 20% interest on this loan. And, if you have a credit card or something, you add 20% interest or 25. The numbers are going to vary, but either way, this is the first scenario we're trying to discuss of whether this scenario counts as excessive. If then you get the $10,000 paid back, but you now owe the bail bonds company $2,000 in interest, you're paying $2,000 for being innocent. The government isn't going to front that interest payment that you paid, that's owed to the bail bonds company. That's how they make a living. The government is not going to pay for that. And so that means that you, as a person who was accused of a crime that didn't have enough money to get straight out of jail on your own with bail, you're basically getting fined $2,000 for not being wealthy and for being innocent. Does that make sense? So that's now the other side of the argument is, well, if we don't have bail at all, then it doesn't give the person that's charged with the crime an incentive to come back to court. That I think is very reasonable, easy to agree on. I don't think many legal scholars anywhere in political science in the United States would say just get rid of bail all out. But what bail is at least when you look at the founders, bail is meant to incentivize someone to come back from their trial, but not to necessarily force them to stay in jail when they're innocent. Bail, again, it allows for that presumption of innocence. Now, let's take this scenario where you think that, well, too bad, so sad. You did pay $10,000 bail, but bail bonds companies are. And by the way, it's not an attack on that company, but the alternative argument would be that we can't play around with bail. We can't make it less, or people won't show up to trial, and it'll encourage crime. Then there's also kind of a third path, which is, um, should bail be? And this is a question that I think everybody should really think about. I'd love to hear what you all think. Should bail be a flat fee per crime? So, say if you're accused of robbing, it's a $10,000, or should it be based on one's ability to pay? In other words, your income level. So, if you are in a very, very impoverished person, should your is $10,000 excessive to you? Of course it is. Um, but if you're a millionaire, $10,000 is like pocket change. So the third option here is, and this is just a question to throw out to you all. I can't wait to hear what you think. Should bail be based on just a set fee for each crime, so that it's just $10,000 or whatever it is, so there's no favoritism, or does that punish the poor more so than wealthy people, simply because that a $10,000 check to a wealthy person is not necessarily significant. If you're Elon Musk or somebody really wealthy, that's not a lot. That's nothing. So that's the question: should it be replaced with um, a system where it's based on your ability to pay? And ideally, I think people who would be concerned about changing it that way would say, well, if you're going to do that, you can't make the payment like zero, though, because then people won't come back. And this is just a fascinating dialogue to have back and forth. You can argue, I think there are liberal and conservative arguments for all sides of this issue, so it's pretty fascinating to think about. So, bail is again, it's defined as you're putting up some money in a temporary situation so that you can go back and live your normal life, and so that when the trial does come, you're able to not have just been sitting in jail that whole time. And so, just so you know, California, we're going to talk about a couple ballot propositions. California, a few years ago, voters in California, and whenever I say that, I just mean the based on a proposition, which side won. California voters, the majority said they didn't want to replace the bail system as it currently is with mostly flat fees. They did not want to change it to how much it should be based on how much your income is. So, in other words, California voters rejected changing the bail amount to be based on what you pay proportionally and kept it as largely a flat sum. So people who are sad that that didn't pass are going to say, well, that means that if I'm rich, I can just go, get out of jail. Um, there's a pretty infamous, a guy that was on an HBO documentary, and his name is Robert Durst, and I believe that he was essentially accused of murder, and he's a very wealthy person, and it all of this public news came out. There's a John Oliver comedy bit that he discusses it in there as well. This guy Robert Durst, almost in this documentary about the accusation of murder that's been levied against him, says on HBO, and this or I think it aired on HBO, said, "Hey, this this murder charge." The guy that's interviewing him says, "Did you what did you intend to do when you paid the bail? Like, was your plan to come back?" And the bail was set at $250,000. So this guy's accused of murder, $250,000, but he's mega rich. So the interview asks him, and Robert Durst essentially says, "Goodbye, $250,000. Goodbye, jail. I'm out." I mean, literally. Um, that is what people who want to change the bail system hate. That type of thing, where if you're extremely rich, there's it doesn't inhibit you from taking off. Now, as it would turn out, he later did pretty foolishly doing that documentary. I'm thankful in a way because he got caught. And then he has been prosecuted for murder. So it's a fascinating case, but that highlights the issue pretty well. Now let's talk about fines. I'm gonna put a companion video on with this. There's a lot of really funny ones, and I just want you to be able to enjoy a little bit of comedy with what we're learning, and just to see what things can look like through an everyday lens, to be able to apply this stuff to real life. But in the piece that you're also going to see, it's about excessive fines, and so that's the second part of four parts of the Eighth Amendment. So the excessive fines is, now that we've discussed the whole concept of excessive, it's easier now because we just apply it to fines. So here's the next question: what counts as excessive for a fine? So let's say, in most cases, parking, I think parking would probably be a good one to use as an example, because if you park in the wrong spot, and unless you're like, say, blocking a fire lane or some like dangerous parking, like that could endanger people somehow, let's say it's a parking ticket. And I say that just for this analogy instead of saying a speeding ticket, because if you speed enough, you could recklessly kill someone by accident, or so let's take a parking ticket. If you park in the wrong place to go to school and you're crossing the street and you come back after class and you have $100 ticket on your windshield. If you're a student, if you're any number, if you work minimum wage, if you, depending on who you are, and maybe for most people, $100 is a massive punishment because that's my electric bill for the month, or that's half of my, not half of my rent. Would be great, wouldn't it? That's my grocery bill for the month. That's my gas for the month. So $100 might not seem like a lot, though, to a wealthy person. So the extreme version of this analogy would be that if you're wealthy, you just park wherever you want, whenever you want. You get fined, you pay the fees, and it doesn't matter, and you get to live like royally. Well, everyone else has to obey the rules because you're rich enough to just pay them off, and it doesn't really affect you financially. Um, that is now the other side of the argument again is saying, look, it would now. I think actually, to be fair, the best criticism I've heard of best criticism I've heard regarding making everyone pay based on their income. The biggest argument is, if how is the government going to be able to do this for everybody for every ticket? You're going to have to go in. You're going to have to go to the IRS or H&R Block and look up your taxes and show them how much you made last year, or show them a current pay stub, or this or that. I mean, I think the best argument against changing it to how much you should pay, how much based on what you earn, is that looking at what you earned and going through your taxes and deciding what counts for you as excessive and not going past that line would take an enormous amount of work and government bureaucracy, red tape. It would take a long time. It would be a very big venture, and so it'd be really costly. Um, Other side would say, even if that is the case, why should somebody who's poor or doesn't have that much money be hammered by a ticket when a rich person paying the same amount, yes, it is the same amount, but to them it's nothing. So they can just break the rules all they want and pay off the fines and just keep on going. I hope that makes sense, but that's a fascinating back and forth argument. Um, I think realistically, the question is, how can we sit as a society and decide and everyone agree on what counts as excessive? And that's why the Constitution, it's fascinating, and it could be debated essentially forever. And there's so many scenarios. But as you watch that comedy piece by John Oliver about excessive fines, I'm curious what your all's thoughts would be, and if you think that it should be handled a different way by the government, that there should be a new standard that is. So here would be an argument that to change it based on income, to make it a counter argument to, it would be really difficult to find everyone's tax money and to know how much to pay you or how much to charge you, because the proportion of everyone's income is not the same. It would be a lot of paperwork. The counterpoint to that is, well, when you say do your taxes at the end of the year, they could just be automatically entered into a system that is the police system for parking and car traffic tickets. And so there may be ways to nullify that argument that it would just take too long and be too big of a bureaucratic process to get everyone's income and then decide how much their ticket is. There's arguments to be said that, well, we could just make a database and have what's already there. The government knows what everyone's making. You have to do your taxes, to just basically cut and paste that into this other system, so that police would give, when they give the ticket, the amount would be based on a prearranged amount that from based on the amount of money you made last year, uh, via your taxes. So, okay, now if that wasn't controversial enough, now we get to points 3 and 4 of the Eighth Amendment. So the Eighth Amendment also prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. these are two other subjective words. I use Forgive me, I use the term subjective a lot. So if you don't know what it means, subjective is essentially an opinion based question where there isn't necessarily one right answer, and objective is like math or science where one plus one just equals two. It's not really a question. There's no gray area. It just is what it is. But that's not, these are not objective words. What counts as excessive is a very subjective thing. And so let's look at, for example, first, what counts as excessive, what counts as cruel punishment, and what counts as unusual punishment, just like what counts as an excessive amount of bail or excessive fine. Cruel to some people would be, um, some people, we could go from the whole spectrum. Cruel for some people would be, torture. I think, and we're going to go through what the government has agreed, the Supreme Court has ruled, and that is basically codified. It does count as cruel. But there's going to be consensus from most people that torture would be considered cruel. That there are other forms of punishment that I think the stocks. I think that would be one I've really would have really hated. Um, because your head is stuck in that board in your hands, and you're just standing there all day for who knows how long. Um, but then the other side of the argument immediately is, well, if we're talking about, let's say the people that we're referring to this punishment that's going to be either, well, it's not allowed to be either cruel or unusual. People who would be less sympathetic and say this isn't cruel is they would say, look, if somebody's a murderer, they don't deserve, you know, um, luxury. They don't deserve to go sit and, fall asleep peacefully, which where people would refer to probably a lethal injection that favor the death penalty. They would just say it's basically like you're just falling asleep, you're never waking up. Like, how could that possibly be cruel? Like, after you murdered a family, and that's as merciful as you could ask for. So, some people would reject outright that the death penalty can ever be cruel. Others would say it can be cruel, but will prohibit those ways. You don't torture someone to death, but the cruel part really is up for debate. Now, one question we could ask: what are the things that for sure are considered cruel and are essentially banned under U.S. federal and state laws? So torture is one. Torture is considered cruel. Now, another question is, what do you count as torture? And obviously, if you remember the lecture when I talked about Guantanamo Bay and President Obama and shutting it down, and John McCain, who also wanted to shut it down, and then it's still open, they use the government used the term enhanced interrogation techniques. That's code for torture mostly, waterboarding and things like that. I try not to go into the details because it's pretty intense, but just the idea of the question is, does somebody who has, say, committed murder, is it torturous to say, I don't know, put them to death at all? Is it cruel at all? Like, in other words, they have to wait and they don't know when it's going to happen. And the other side's going to say, no, stop feeling sorry for people. So they agree. Just the question of what counts as cruel. Torture is definitely, legally, at least with police and FBI and non non-enemy combatant enhanced interrogation, war on terror techniques, torture is prohibited. What else counts as cruel is, putting someone to death that committed a crime when they were under the age of 18. So the Supreme Court has ruled this. In fact, it was a case that I will never forget, and I wish I didn't know about even because of my proximity. But when I lived in Virginia and I was in college playing soccer, playing NCAA, and we're traveling all over the East Coast for our games, and on the news there starts to become more often this news that there are people being shot in random places in Virginia, and there's not like a sound. It's as if someone's being sniped, just from nowhere, and nobody knows who's doing it, and it's completely random. It's impossible to know where it's going to happen next. And I was one of the first times in my life where I wanted to go play soccer everywhere, but I didn't want to be outside. I don't know who's doing this. And as it turns out, it was a guy who had a younger man with him who was under 18, and thankfully they were caught and the killing ended. But then there was the question of, and this is again in Virginia, which now has outlawed the death penalty, but the issue was, should the guy who's under 18 be put to death as well as the guy who was of full age? And the way it went down is the Supreme Court said, the if you are under 18 when you commit a crime, you can't be given the death penalty. So that would be considered cruel. And I think the scientific argument would be essentially your brain hasn't been fully developed. And in this case, and it doesn't in any way, shape, or form justify this person's behavior, but I think the Supreme Court probably took into account that the younger person is impressionable, and so yes, they're going to go to jail for the rest of their life and die of old age or prison, but they're not going to get the death penalty. And so so far, torture and killing minors, or people, obviously when you committed the crime you were a minor, cannot later, even if you by the time you turn 30, is that when the death penalty would have happened, it's when you committed the crime. And then another prohibition that you may be familiar with is, if the person does not have the mental capacity to understand what they did, or is deemed to be unable to understand. Just so you know, for all of these, no one is going to argue for people to just not go to jail. The argument is this: are they going to die of old age in prison, or are they going to die from lethal injection in prison? And that's what we're going to get to in a second with the unusual part and the death penalty. But with the cruel part, it's considered cruel, and it's illegal to essentially put someone to death who doesn't is deemed not to have the mental capacity. Again, you're not letting them out. They're not going on a holiday. They're going to go to be secure, locked up, in maybe perhaps a mental institution or something similar, but they're not going to be put to death. And the example I could think of was, something I even referenced the other day when we were learning about public defenders. The lady who had to represent the Parkland shooter, she actually, the one thing she kind of did, and she doesn't just remember the last. It's an impossible situation. I mean, nobody wants to represent a school shooter. I felt so bad for her just as a human being sitting in that court, because she's trying to do, she's she's a human being, and there's this constitutional task that, yeah, even, openly awful, everyone gets a lawyer, and so that's just what it is. And the one thing that was, I guess, a success from the perspective of people who are against the death penalty is that, and I'm not going to say his name, but the young man who did that school shooting was found that he was not mentally competent enough to go and do it in a way that would then result in the government being allowed to execute him. So let me put it more simply. He was found to not have the mental capacity, so that it would have been cruel, according to the government, to kill him, and so therefore he dies of old age in prison. Now, the next thing that we get to, and we'll talk about unusual in a second, but it's kind of right in between both. Here's the next question: what are the arguments for the death penalty? And what are the arguments against, outside of the cruel and unusual, and to some extent fusing them together? One thing that everyone has probably heard about at some point or another is, when if you've debated the death penalty with someone, or talked to someone about it, or thought about it, or had conversations, anything, there are usually two sides. One would say, I don't want to pay for someone who murdered a family to go sit in prison and have 3 square meals a day and have health care and have, maybe TVs, and at least they're going to be reading books in there. And I don't want to pay for them to do that. I don't want to, I put the, this is people who support the death penalty, put them to death. Taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for that. Here's the other side of that argument. The problem with that, and this is where it becomes objective, this part. Objectively, and I'll give you a specific scenario. In Florida, it would save the government of Florida over $40 million if they abolished the death penalty and replaced it with life in prison, no parole. And there's been several studies that indicate this. Um, the one I'm referring to, you can find, if you want, I'll send you the article. Reason.com and some other uh, like sort of political advocacy groups have worked with death penalty opponents, and there's been research done that it's public information. So you'd be able to find in the budget of a state, how much does it actually cost to put someone. So it isn't some secret number. It's just that compiling it takes a bit of time, and most people don't know that. To put it this way, and it is state by state, and it is much, much more expensive to put someone to death, to execute them, to give them the death penalty, than it is to keep them in life with no parole in prison. So, again, this is really important to underline. No logical person is arguing it's between the death penalty and letting them out. The question is not, no one's going to argue that. No logical human being will argue. What we're saying is that if you are guilty, you're either going to die of execution or you're going to die of old age. You're either going to die of lethal injection or you're going to, either way, you're dying in prison. So that's important to know, that when these arguments or discussions happen, and if there are arguments, it may be because things are taken out of context. That's the argument, is not letting someone out. The argument is, do they die of old age, or they die of, or natural causes, or they die of lethal injection. Um, that brings us to another question: who does the lethal injection? Um, are doctors ethically allowed to do it? If you've ever heard of the Hippocratic Oath, um, generally the idea that doctors are supposed to do what's in the best interest of the patient, essentially. Um, what this question I'm asking is this: who are the people that actually administer the lethal injection? And that is the most common method. Um, are they medical experts? First of all. Second of all, where is the poison coming from? Who's making it? Um, I don't know a single state that has a death penalty where that's public information to know where is the source, the actual literal source of the lethal injection poison. So that's another thing people would say. But then people would say, well, that still doesn't make sense to me, because it's not can't be that expensive to get this poison and to, pay a prison guard to put a vein in some, or a needle, and just, lethal injection. But then that forgets this point. And if you want to write this down, why is it so much more expensive to put someone to death? And the answer in one word is appeals. Appeal to, if you are given the death penalty, whether you're innocent or guilty, let's just say you just don't want to die from lethal injection, you're gonna appeal your verdict. You're gonna appeal. And so we know that we said the Sixth Amendment, you have a right to an attorney. Now, what I'm going to tell you next is probably going to surprise a lot of you. It surprised me because I came from Virginia, where there was kind of a political, like, I'd say, stereotype when I was growing up among some groups of people that Florida, or excuse me, that California is super liberal on all types of issues. So I think that when I was younger, and then I ended up moving here, I didn't really know what different parts of the country felt about different topics like the death penalty. But I had assumed that what I had heard as a kid, like, well, California is really liberal. And why I say that is because the liberal side generally on this is against the death penalty, and the conservative side is generally for it. So Republicans overall are for it, Democrats against it. But what surprised me was in 2016, there were two propositions on the California ballot. Proposition 62 was a proposition that said, yes or no, should we ban execution? Should we ban the death penalty in California and replace it with life in prison, no parole? So that's option number one. If that passes, there's still a Prop 66 that says almost the opposite. On the same ballot, a couple spots down, the same year, the same day when you're filling it out, if you were there, if you were voting at that time, or someone you know was old enough to vote at that time, there's the 66 proposition, which says not only are we going to keep the death penalty, we're going to speed it up, essentially. And that would mean to limit the appeals process to 5 years and to make it much cheaper for the government to not have to do as many lawyers appeals and all of the things that end up costing the government so much money to put someone to death. So stay with me. If this doesn't make sense, what I'm saying is it costs a lot more money to put someone to death because the lawyers' fees. The government has to go through a lot of processes to make this happen legally. And it's a long process and it can take decades and decades. So California has this decision on 2016. And the question is now, the reason just to give you an example, like I believe Hillary Clinton won California by about 3 million votes. Biden won by over 6 million votes. And they're at least now both against the death penalty generally. Although is a caveat with someone in Guantanamo Bay that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is taking a plea deal that the Biden administration has essentially rejected. But generally speaking, you have these two parties standing in different places, but the liberal side is very much more so against the death penalty. So I assumed that in 2016, that when the vote took place, that California would adopt Proposition 62. So I predicted they would ban the death penalty and also vote no on speeding it up. But I was wrong. I was very wrong. I was completely wrong. It was the exact opposite. So Prop 62 failed. Prohibition of death penalty did not pass. Let me say, sorry, a simpler way. The death penalty is still legal according to Prop 62 and a majority of California's votes. And it's not only just legal, it's been sped up. And arguably, on the books, is arguably almost the strictest death penalty laws in the nation. That surprised me as somebody who watches politics from the outside and doesn't subscribe to one party or the other. I was fascinated and just very surprised at the way that. But the argument is that if you let someone appeal indefinitely, so I'm going to take the side of Prop 66 for a second. Obviously, I'm not taking actual sides. The people who would say to speed up the death penalty are saying, "Hey, look, the reason it costs so much money is because these dang appeals. They go on and on. We already know your jury found you guilty. You've appealed. There's no more evidence. Stop stalling. It's taking the taxpayers' money. You killed a family. We're going to put you to death." So that is the law in California now. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. How come on the news I don't see anything about death penalty? Well, because Governor Newsom, when he became governor, said he was putting a moratorium on the death penalty, which is a fancy way of saying he's pausing it. When he's governor, it will not take place. And remember, we learned that governors, just like presidents, have the power to pardon. So it's essentially within the power of the governor. Now, the voters who voted to keep the death penalty and speed it up probably wouldn't like the fact that Governor Newsom is doing that because he's, in their view, overriding their will of the people. But in his view, he's saying that this is something that the voters were wrong about, and I'm just not going to have it happen on my watch. So that is a fascinating question. So now you have states like California where it is on the books, but it's just not right now not being used. I would guess that most governors, if not all, now elected in the future in California would probably do what Newsom has done, I would guess. But hey, I've been wrong about California politics before, so but it's a fascinating question, isn't it? And so now so we've gotten to the cruel part, and we said that torture is cruel. That I mean, these are the ones that are universally accepted. Torture is universally accepted as cruel and unusual, as well as somebody who's a minor when the crime was committed, as well as somebody who doesn't have the mental capacity to comprehend the crime they did. And then the final question is really this: is what is it unusual that humans in societies in the history of the forgive me, not the history of the United States, in the history of the world, the history of humankind, humanity in every culture ever recorded, if you compiled all of that and you asked of all that, looking at every society ever, how many of these cultures or societies or communities or countries or nations or states or territories, how many of them had some form of the death penalty? um, there's going to be more that had it than that didn't have it, right? In other words, here's where it gets interesting. It's not unusual in human history for the death penalty to be levied. But the question is is it unusual today? And if you're on the more liberal side on this one, you're going to say, well, look at Europe, look at South Africa, look at the countries that have banned the death penalty. They're horrified that the United States does this. And then there's another point to be made that, you know, I think two final points we could make about death penalty, one on each side, is what if you kill an innocent person? There was a case a couple of months ago, death penalty case in Oklahoma. There were two men, both accused of a string of murders. Um, One man, as they were both convicted, sentenced to death, on death row for quite a while. One of the men, in the last year or so, as the time's getting closer for them to actually finally, be executed, one of the men says and writes a letter to the warden and to the prison guards and tries to get it out there, saying like, "Look, this has been on my conscience forever, but this other guy who's going down for this crime with me, he didn't do it. Like I lied. I just brought him into it because I thought it would give me less punishment, but like I'm gonna get the death penalty's coming for me. Like I can't have this on my conscience," type of thing. So the first of all, people who had no sympathy were like, "Of course he said that. He's trying to like get right with everything before he dies. Like he's a murderer. Also, he's probably a liar too. So don't trust his letter. Like this is some why now this confession?" But then other people would say, "But what if he's really now like is telling the truth and this other guy is innocent?" Well, they were put to death back to back, like an hour in between. And the last words of the first man who said this other guy didn't actually do it, his last words were, "Don't put him to death. He's an innocent man. I'm the one who deserves to die. He didn't do anything." And they that person died, and then without much hesitation at all, the man who had been proclaimed innocent by his, I guess, friend, I don't know exactly the relationship, but his cellmate, he's also put to death. So there's two sides to this type of story. One is, come on, they're criminals. If you're gonna murder people, you're gonna lie to. The other side is, but what if he was telling the truth? What if he really did like feel guilty and was like, dude, this guy is gonna die, an innocent man. I'm telling the truth. Just like take my word for it now, please. Um, I don't know if we'll ever know, but that's one huge argument against the death penalty. I think the best argument I've heard for it, besides just the emotional reason of if your family got killed, would you want the person who did it to die? Taking that out to try to be objective, I think the strongest argument I've heard in favor of the death penalty is that it gives the government a bargaining chip. And what I mean is that if someone's accused of murder and they say, well, if you tell us where these bodies are hidden, we'll take the death penalty off the table. Like we will not push for the death penalty. We will not even put it and ask in front of the court. We will say we want you to have life in prison with no parole. So tell us where the bodies are. It gives a bargaining chip to the government to say, well, if you don't want to tell us where the bodies are, or if you don't want to admit you did it, we will put you to death. But if you say it and you admit it and give these families some closure, then that's a different story. So that's a very good, I think, argument in favor of the death penalty. But the very good argument opposing that is, again, does the government have the right to kill a human being? Um, is it cruel and unusual to kill someone at all? And which which side is right, and which policy is what's going to be going forward for the United States? And by the way, the United States has about as many death penalty policies as we do states. Now, I'll tell you one story because I always like try to give you something interesting to think about at the end. Um, so remember, presidents have the right to pardon a federal prisoner, or to stop their execution. And they also have power to sign off on it once it's already been sort of approved and gone through all that. So when Trump was leaving office, he had lost the election first Tuesday in November. As we know, there was the January 6th, and he didn't and doesn't still admit that he lost. Um, but what he did do, and this was something that came to the attention of a lot of death penalty opponents. Um, when Trump, well, before this time, when Trump was younger, there were several African American men who were accused of assaulting a woman, falsely accused, in Central Park. And as a private citizen, Donald Trump put out in the New York Times a full page ad of bringing back the death penalty, and it had their pictures there. Um, there's definitely, for many people, a racial element to that accusation, as well as the statement of bringing it back. But then, as it turns out, they're innocent. And they've kind of made it a public deal to say, I mean, the least you could do is apologize. Uh, I mean, putting our names out there for the death penalty when we didn't do it, and then when you find out we really didn't, you don't take it back. So I say that pre-story to say Trump has long felt that the death penalty is fair, so I don't think he's shifted on that issue. But what happened from the election of Joe Biden until January 20th, when Joe Biden was sworn in that last 3 months where Trump was trying to hold on to power, he actually authorized and signed off on more federal executions in that 3 month period than all other US presidents in that same time period combined. So, what would Trump say and Trump supporters say about that? They would say he doesn't mess around. We're not going to play nice with terrorists or people who have done horrible murderous crimes. Like, people that defend Trump's actions there are going to say, first of all, these people are already on death row. Second of all, he's not deciding that they were the ones that were guilty. It's already there. He's just saying, let's get it done now. The other side is going to say, you lost an election. You got people killed on January 6th over it. Your vice president was almost hung and you didn't stop it. You probably fired up that death penalty chamber because you were mad about losing the election. This was something you could do to let off some steam. Yes, I've heard both of these arguments. Can you imagine how divided our country is when one group of people thinks that that Trump is doing this out of vengeance, and another group thinks that he's making a political point that's been consistent with his platform since calling out for the death penalty way back in the, I think it was the 70s, 80s. Um, so that's a fascinating debate to have. I'll just tell you that this election, I think, will there'll be an issue that will come up in the debates between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and I'm really interested to see what the arguments will be for both, because um, I guess one final thing we could think about would be, I've had a lot of students tell me this is inconsistent, Professor V. Democrats say they're pro-choice, but then they're anti-death penalty. Republicans say they're pro-life, but then they're pro-death penalty. So what's going on? I have students that ask me this all the time. Is this like hypocrisy, or is it inconsistent ideology by the parties? I would say that that's a fair possibility. But what else we'll say is that there's also this sort of middle ground where I think states can come to compromises about, what is the best way to deter crime in the future, without violating the Eighth Amendment, without cruel and unusual punishment. And so, what Democrats might say to Republicans is, so you oppose the Affordable Care Act, which was Obamacare, because you don't want the government in charge of your health care. So Democrats would say something like this: you don't trust government with your health care, but you trust government with death care. Does that make sense? That you're a Democrat might say, if you're to a Republican, if you're not trusting of the government to take care of your health care, how in the world do you trust them to put people to death? And then on the other side, Republicans are going to say, well, why are you so persistent in fighting for people who have murdered whole families and have done these horrible things? And you're giving them sympathy, you're being soft on crime. And now future murderers are going to say, well, I'm not going to get the death penalty because it's the Democrats never pushed for it. So I can just commit these crimes, and at worst, I'll just go to prison. Do you see how these two go back and forth? I mean, it's a fascinating question. I can't wait to hear what you all think. Um, Thanks in advance for being kind through the controversy of all this, because this is tough stuff to tackle, but it's so fascinating, it's so interesting, and it's so important. So all the best. God bless. See you soon, inshallah, Professor V.